want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. My name's Matt Rousu. I'm Dean of the Sigmund Weiss School of Business at Susquehanna University. Absolutely thrilled to have Ed Conard here tonight. I have the bio on my phone, but I think I know enough where I can go swing a bio without looking it up, but correct me if I get any details wrong. So Ed has a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Notable career highlight would be being one of the founding directors of Bain Capital, where he worked with his colleague and friend Mitt Romney for many years. And where I got to know Ed's name was, I've taught a class several times called Political Economic Thought. And many years ago, I used Ed's first top 10 New York Times bestselling book. It's called Unintended Consequences.
Thank you, Mitt Romney.
And so that class, we read books from authors from politically left to politically right, and it was a wonderful book to add in that curriculum. And then ended up meeting Ed and actually working with him a little bit on his second top 10 New York Times best-selling book, The Upside of Inequality. And we're absolutely thrilled to welcome him to campus, so let's give him a hand. So the idea for tonight, I'll ask some questions, we'll engage in a bit of a conversation, and there are note cards near you, and if you need note cards, you can wave, and our economics club, who recently read the book, might come find you and hand out the note card. So if you have questions you want to ask, jot them down. We'll leave about 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. So I will start. The title of the talk was What Free Market Advocates Can Learn from Populism. So just as a quick, to make sure everybody in the audience is on the same page, I'd love to hear your definition of what is a free market advocate and your definition of populist, or what is populism.
I'll try to be brief on the definition because I think we could get into a lot of the complications of it, but I just read the definition off the internet, which I think is pretty good, quite frankly. It says, policies that appeal to people who feel their needs have been disregarded by elites in both parties. And I do think that does reflect a lot of the people who voted for President Trump. And I think that their concerns are really threefold. One is that their wage growth has slowed, and that trade and immigration slow their wage gains by increasing the supply of low-skilled labor. That government spending and lower taxes, for that matter, threaten their Social Security and Medicare, and that's a significant piece of their lifetime earnings. We often hear about the Tea Party saying, oh, we want to cut costs, but we don't want to cut Social Security and Medicare. People call them hypocrites. No, I think they want to cut the costs to make sure they get their Social Security and Medicare. And the last is that they recognize that identity-based politics and double standards were aimed at reducing the economic opportunities of men and white people. And I think you find men and white people are the people who probably rallied most around Trump, and those three things really jeopardized or threatened their economic opportunity. I think they're a group of people who they have jobs, they want higher paying jobs, they're not really looking to the government for handouts, they actually resent handouts. And when they look at the two parties, they don't think either party represents what they're interested in. They look to the Republicans, free market, largely driven by free market, and say, hey, these guys want lower wages. They're perfectly happy to have free trade. They want low-skilled immigration because they're business owners who want lower skilled wages. They want tax cuts. That doesn't increase my chances of getting Social Security. And in the case of identity-based politics, they have a lot at stake, so they keep their mouth shut. They're not willing to take the kind of risks that are necessary to push back. I think they're more logically inclined to be Republicans than Democrats, because if you look at these issues on Democrats, they're just not going to cede any ground on low-skilled immigration because they're trying to win Arizona and Texas. They want more government spending. I think they're largely aiming that at the poor versus the middle class. And I think just they're going to have no quarter for anybody who's pushing back on identity politics. That is partially what they traffic in. And so it was more logical for them to be part of the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, even though I don't think the Republican Party represented their points of view very well. And why should we care about this? I think the Republican Party had historically been controlled by three factions. One is advocates of free markets, business leaders primarily. The second is foreign policy hawks that want more defense spending. And the third is the religious right who wants conservative judges. And the three of us scratched each other's backs with lower taxes, higher defense spending, and conservative judges. We gave each other what they wanted. I think that President Trump showed that he did, I think, two things. One is that when President Obama handed the reins off to Hillary Clinton, the African-American turnout dropped from 66%, which was a historical high, to 56%, which was where it had been historically averaged. And then President Trump energized primarily white voters without college degrees or without college degrees, so a lot of them have some college, but the ones who felt the most pressure from these forces, and the combination of those two allowed him to win Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, aside from Ohio, states that had traditionally gone to Democrats. And I think he both upended the coalition that controlled the Republican Party, and he showed the Republican Party a new path to the presidency that had not previously been there.
So you touched on this a little bit, but I want to kind of poke at it a little bit more in terms of why should free market advocates be so concerned about populism? Is it about kind of understanding the needs of what, you kind of alluded to Trump voters, but, there are a certain subset of voters who voted Republican in the last election. Is it to try to meet a middle ground? Is it?
Well, I would say, why should they care? Because they want to get elected. They've basically been pushed out of the party, the free market party that they controlled. I think they've been shown a path to the presidency, which is a path that the window is narrowing over time as the demographics shift away towards minorities and towards people who have lower incomes, who have tended to vote Democrat versus Republican. So I think he's shown a path that would allow you to extend that. I think the religious right is becoming smaller and smaller relative to the total as the demographics shift. So that's not enough to put the free market coalition over the goal line anymore. It certainly didn't put Mitt Romney over the goal line. And so I think they have to look at the compromises that need to be made. So I would have said this, look at a lot of my free market Republican buddies don't want to compromise. They're not used to compromising. They've spent their whole lives not compromising and not needing to compromise. And so I think they are sort of, I'm going to take my toys and go home. And they're basically a point of view without a party, not exactly a great place to be in a democracy. I have tried to encourage them that you have to compromise and that you have to separate the president, who's the bright, shiny object in the media, from his supporters, that what matter are his supporters. They are the power behind the throne, and that they have legitimate economic concerns. Now, I think the radical version, I'll call it radical, it's actually not that radical, although I don't believe it. The radical version of free market enterprise is that the free market will make everybody better on average. So yeah, the factory in your town might get closed, but factory workers in general aren't going to be any better off than they would be under the free market system. So yeah, there's statistical variation, and some people might get hurt, other people will benefit. But on average, it's going to make everybody better off. I will give you arguments over the course of today which suggest it isn't true. I'll give you one right now to start, which would be trade. We sell high-skilled labor, Apple operating systems, Google, Facebook, accounting, you name it, to the rest of the world, and we buy low-skilled labor, primarily Chinese and Mexican low-skilled labor. Well, we're creating demand for high-skilled labor. We're creating supply of low-skilled labor. Basic supply and demand would say we're putting upward pressure on high-skilled wages. We're putting higher pressure on low-skilled wages. Well, we know that retirees capture about 15% of GDP. The top 40% captures about 50 to 60% of GDP. So really, when you get to the middle class, you have to believe that they're suffering 100% of the pressure on wages, if there is any pressure, and they're capturing 20 to 30% of the benefits. You have to believe that there are enormous benefits from trade. I don't think, get Paul Krugman, the leader, he's a liberal, but the leading thinker on trade, I don't think he thinks it would be anywhere, the benefits would be anywhere near that kind of magnitude. So I think it's, we are quite certain that free trade is beneficial to everybody. I don't think it's so obvious. I told this, I could take one question and go on the whole day. I grew up in Detroit. I went to a school with 750 kids. 20% of the kids in my high school went to 750, my graduating class. 20% went to college. My best friend worked in his dad's machine shop, made parts for the auto industry. The auto industry moved to the Carolinas, and from the Carolinas to Mexico, and he's now working in a sewer for the city of Livonia, making $15 an hour. He doesn't think trade has created great opportunities for him. And I'll go on and talk a little more about, because I think it's more complicated than just that, but I think they have legitimate economic concerns that we need to address.
Okay, thanks. Before I ask the next question, can everybody hear in the back okay? Yeah. Good deal. So many commentators lament, kind of putting in quotes, the shrinking middle class. Is that something you worry about? And is this something we should be worried about as a society right now?
So I'll give you the statistics on the shrinking middle class. I don't think it's true. It's true, but in a way that doesn't matter. I think what we really care about is how fast our middle class wage is growing. So there's a study out from the OECD, Organization of Economic, Europe and the United States, says that the middle class, a big headline, middle class has shrunk from 60% to from 63% to 60%. Okay, that's barely any change at all. In fact, if you factor in retirees and reductions in labor force participation, you would mathematically get to that number. Pew, which is very highly regarded research and survey, says it's dropped from 61% to 50%. 11-point drop. If you dig into the 11 points, what you find is 7% of Americans have moved up and 4% have moved down. And of the 4% that have moved down, 3% of those are Hispanic immigrants, and 1 point of those are native-born Americans. So if you look at native-born Americans, 1 went down, 7 went up. Pretty good deal. I think I'd take that shrinking of the middle class. So you hear a lot of headlines shrinking to the middle class. I think it turns out because they're moving up, they're not moving down. Second is in my book, and you can see these in some of the back pages, I look at the income distribution of full-time workers, whites, Hispanics, and blacks, African Americans. Now, I said, let's look at full-time workers because obviously if you don't have a full-time job, you're probably not going to be in the middle class if you're a retiree or if you have a disability and you can't work. But if you said, what does the distribution of full-time employment look like in the United States? Across the relevant demographics, all 3 demographics have grown significantly. The distributions look virtually identical. There's been a shift in the demographic mix. What you find is that African Americans and whites have grown, whites probably grown a little bit more, but both of them have grown fairly robustly. As you might expect, Hispanic wages haven't grown nearly as much because there's been an continuing increase in the supply, and so that has pulled the Hispanic wages. You've seen much less growth there, and that's why you see some shift in the distribution. But even if you look at the overall distribution, you would have to squint mighty hard to see any change. So I don't think the issue is the hollowing out of the middle class. I think, and I could go on here for the rest of the hour, I think the issue is the growth of middle class wages. And here's, I think, the crux of the problem. You go back to the 1950s. What were all the highly skilled people in the United States doing? They were designing products for mass market consumers, built in factories with the same set of workers, mass market workers. So all of our most skillful people were trying to make life better for the middle and working class. A couple of things happened along the way. The first is manufacturing productivity grew so robustly that it outstripped the demand for manufactured goods. So we saw a decline in manufacturing employment and a shift to services where the productivity growth in services has been much slower than manufacturing. It's less capital intensive, it's harder to supervise, it's more decentralized. A second thing happened, which is if you look at the technologies that have come along as a result of the personal computer. I wrote them down here so I could remember them all. But the first one is you get enormous computing capability. You go into the moon with a slide rule, Now you have a supercomputer that you can do calculations, you have spreadsheets, et cetera. So there's calculating power. The second is word processing. You're not using whiteout on your computer to, type on a typewriter. Half the people here are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Going to the copy machine, all that crazy stuff. The third is what I'd call internet and email, which allows you to communicate with people without having to synchronize in time. So you would get on the phone and call people, and you could never get anybody because they were busy. I can send out 50 emails a day, day after day after day. That's basically 50 answered phone calls. So the networking capability of that is unbelievable. Then you have the knowledge that's been posted on the internet, and Google, which allows you to search it, has given you access to research papers. I just say, ask the genius, you're a genius. You just check your pocket, and the genius gives you the answer. On top of that is enterprise software, which is just inundated smart, thoughtful business people with data and information. And lastly, I think the least most important one is the smartphone, which allows you to work at any time of the day, but that's probably small in comparison to the other things that happen. Okay, most people are playing games with all this. There's a small group of talented people, largely business people and some engineers and scientists, who are making money with those technologies. I don't know, 10-fold increase in productivity, 100-fold increase in productivity. There's been an enormous increase in productivity at the highest end. People who are using these tools to make money. What's the first thing they did? They said, manufacturing is not a great place to be because it's not growing, the employment's not growing. I want to be a manager, and I don't want to manage a shrinking workforce. I want to manage a growing workforce, so I'm not going to stay there. Second thing is, we know from sports, talent is power law distributed, and every person has overconfident in their ability, and they've got all this technology which makes them way more productive. And we saw a massive reorganization of business where everybody moved out of, all the talent moved out of collective enterprises, big Fortune 500 companies, and into small, high-skilled businesses. So, you saw the rise of finance, the rise of management consulting, the rise of accounting, the rise of computer programming. All of these tasks are tasks where we can measure the individual performance of people, which guess what? People at the high end of the wage scale, that's exactly what they want. And we saw, and you can see this in the data, a huge reorganization of business. Couple other things as well. When you get into the world of information, you can scale up to world scale without having to invest a nickel. Companies like Google and Facebook are cash flow positive all the way to $100 billion. They don't need any investors. And so what you find is, and I'm using those as the examples that we all know, but in the skill-based, information-based sector of the economy, you don't really need any capital, so you don't have to share your success with investors. You can basically keep it all for yourself. Unlike, say, if you're a Ford Motor Company, you want to scale up, you got to build factories, you got to have inventory, you got to have dealers, you need computer systems. You need an enormous investment, which means the individual is not going to negotiate and capture much of the value compared to these other businesses. So we stumbled on this sort of wormhole where, oh my God, we can scale up to economy-wide success. Meanwhile, a teacher can only teach as many students in their class, a doctor can only do as many patients, so you are going to see this enormous increase in inequality at the top, but you'll see where I'm getting to here. I know I've gone off on a huge thing here, but the next thing we discovered is there's more opportunity there than there is talent. So the wages start going up on the talent there, and because there's a lot of opportunity, we saw a lot more entrepreneurial risk-taking. And what we care about are small companies that grow larger. We care about everything, but in terms of economics and what's going to grow the economy. You go open up a restaurant, you're basically taking the customers from the guy across the street. You're not actually increasing employment that much. It really is small companies that grow large. They're largely in the tech sector. We hear a lot about how people aren't starting small businesses. If you really look at tech companies and high-skilled workers, there's way more startups, way more money going into technology today than there was at the peak in 2000. There's a lot more risk-taking, so you're going to see a lot more success. But the net effect of this is that the talented workers have left everybody else behind. And the bottleneck is not capital. as I was saying to some people here, go look at the financial crisis. We ran a trade deficit of 6%. It flooded the economy with risk-averse savings from the rest of the world coming in the opposite direction to balance. Okay, it's not like business where the guys who outbid everybody for the money. No, subprime homeowners with lousy credit ratings outbid everybody for the money. So it's not as though business really had to get, so the binding constraint to the economy is not capital. That's the weird thing about capitalism. It should be called talentism. Okay, the binding constraint is talent. Well, guess what talent is going to work on when it's the binding constraint? Increasing the productivity of talent. Writing software, coming up with technology that it makes the talented people even more productive. And the more productive they get, the more they earn. And the more they earn, the more we're going to cater to their needs. And now you have all the guys in the middle saying, well, wait a second. Used to be working on my needs. Now your Google or your Apple, you don't have any blue-collar employees. To the extent you create any blue-collar employees, you ship them all out to China. And you look at all the most successful, most valuable companies, from Goldman Sachs to McKinsey to Apple to Microsoft, they don't employ a single blue-collar worker. And so we, the talent, have left these guys behind. And so you say, okay, now let's have international trade. Oh yeah, how does that work? It's like, yeah, we start selling our labor to the rest of the world where you guys remain unsupervised. Let's have low-skilled immigration. We go, the binding constraint is talent. What makes a low-skilled worker more productive? Engineering, supervision, management. We go, sorry, we don't have time for that. Why don't you trim my hedges? I got to get back to work to writing software, so do a job that doesn't require my supervision. Almost every aspect of this we go, oh, let's Skype in talented workers from Romania. It's like, yeah, well, there's more talent in the United States supervising talent in Romania instead of supervising the talent in the United States. I think these guys have a legitimate complaint that we need to be a lot more thoughtful about.
No, great answer. So the blog?
I just gave you the history of the modern economy.
You're working on book 3, right, as we speak.
Yes.
Notes from book 3.
I would have said this too, which is the economy's highly circumstantial. So economics is driven, we're trying to find these universal truths so they can win a Nobel Prize, write a paper, but it's super circumstantial, like a game of chess. Yeah, I can give you all the theory of chess, but if you don't go down and look at that position really, really carefully, it's constantly, tomorrow we could go, oh, global warming is going to kill us, so we need a massive capital-intensive economy to solve this problem. We could have a completely different structure to the economy as a result. It's information technology which causes it to be this way at this point in time.
So you mentioned there's a shortage of talentism. I've
Yeah.
not heard that before. And that
I'm looking for a better
then
name.
The talent, there's a shortage of talent, which means the talent is going to get higher wages, which kind of segues into the next question. So your recent best-selling book is titled The Upside of Inequality. And in there, you are critical of some of the arguments made by, and I'm sure I'll pronounce it right, Thomas Piketty, I believe, that inequality is something we should worry about. So the question, should we worry about this? I think we know the answer based on the title of your book. So why not? Or what is the upside of inequality? And maybe what are 1 or 2 reasons why inequality, in your view, is beneficial?
So I'll give you a shocking statistic. It's not in the book, but it's in the next book. Okay. You can put it in your next book. 8% of Americans, so the OECD administers tests, academic tests, to adults. They also administer them to students as well, but I think they do like 10,000 randomly selected adults in all OECD countries. 8% of Americans score at level 4 and 5. Those are the highest levels. It's top 8%. 28% of Americans score level 1 or below. Below means we can't score your test. So we have 1 high score for every 3 low scores. Okay, Germany is 14 high, 18 low. It's almost 1-to-1. They have about, we have 1 high score for every 3 low scores. They have almost 1-to-1. They have about 3 times as many high scores per low score as we have. So they have way more management talent, if you will, than we have. Scandinavia, the darling of liberal comparisons, has 4 times as many. Japan has 5 times as many. So we enter this competition, this global competition, with a much bigger home domestic management problem, okay, and much less talent to go solve the problem. Oh, by the way, in terms of the home problem, we've been super successful at creating technology for increasing the productivity of high-skilled workers, which means we have even less supervision focused on the other 28%, which is way bigger than it is in all the other high-wage economies. So what do we need from our most talented people? A lot of productivity. Now, we know exactly, we could, I'll give you a couple other measures. I've given you this one that's just extraordinary, but since 1995, the internet's basically commercialized in 93. I think Internet Explorer comes out in 93. Email basically starts in 93. From 1995 on, the United States has income, this is their nominal income adjusted for purchasing power, including, say, health care provided by the government and things like that. So real effort by the OECD to make the numbers comparable. The United States median household disposable income has grown 110%. That's nominal. But Germany at that same time has grown 95%. So from the World War II, when we destroyed Germany, to about the late 1980s, Europe was catching up to the United States. It caught up, it got to about 80%. I think we were about 18% more productive than Germany in 1995. When the internet was, today we're at 28%. So what's the upside of inequality? We want to drive our middle and working class, the rich and talented are going to take care of themselves. We want to drive the middle and working class wages up. We want to drive them up faster than the world in the face of these forces. And what we need is enormous productivity from our talent. Now, we look at like one measure of how much innovation is being created, which is the real driver of growth. Oh, by the way, when you look at this, we're 28% more productive than Germany. Without U.S. innovation, which I'll talk about here in a second, their incomes would be substantially lower than our incomes would be. Without freeloading on our military, their incomes would be substantially lower. So the 28's actually on the low end of the range. But if you look at billion-dollar privately held tech startups, so-called unicorns, we're producing about 7 times as many as Europe with half the talent. Where our populations are about the same size, we're producing 7 times as much with half the talent. Okay. Now, if you look at, I show another thing that will put this in perspective. Look at Scandinavian Americans. They're earning 60% more than their counterparts in Scandinavia. If you take out Norway, which looks like Saudi Arabia, because of the oil in the North Sea. So we have gotten enormous productivity out of our talent. You'd like more of it to flow to the middle and working class, but more of it has flown to the middle and working class than it has in any other high-wage economy. I generally make comparisons to Germany because it is the second most prosperous economy, and you say, well, let's compare to that one and see how it's going. We can compare to all the other ones, and it's worse than that. So now, what has caused our guys to be so much more productive? I think we know the answer to that. If you get exposure to cutting edge ideas at companies like Google and Facebook and Intel, Microsoft, whatever, you will be a lot more successful. So you have to grow the institutional capabilities, the companies that make your workforce more productive. And that workforce, it grows gradually over time. And they have a huge multiplicative effect on the productivity of your workers. Now, I always say this, if you look at venture capital, the returns are lousy. And if you look, they're lousy, they're mediocre. They are basically equal to the public markets. It says, venture capitalists aren't doing so great. If you look at the workers in startups, they're exposed to the unsystematic risk of being in a startup. They can't diversify like a venture capital firm. So the amount of risk that they're seeing is extraordinary compared to what an investor's seeing. An investor's only seeing average returns, mediocre returns. So you need to have an enormous multiplicative effect on the likelihood of payoff for success, if you want to get your talented people who could be doctors, lawyers, corporate executives in large businesses, they're going to make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and retire with millions of dollars, several millions of dollars per year. You've got to get those talented people to walk away from those jobs and take chances where they have 1 in 100 chance of being successful. And we'll get to another question here, but it doesn't work if you get 1, 2, 3, 4 guys to do it. You need armies of guys to do it. We have been able to do it in the United States. Europe has been just a systematic failure, and Japan has been a systematic failure in this. So that is the upside.
That's well said, well said. Actually, my next question is about European countries, and I think you hit enough on that.
Probably.
I'll skip to the next to get into as many as we can here. So there are people who will argue that the wealth, we've mentioned, Microsoft and Amazon, Google, like Bill Gates, Jeffrey Bezos, the founders of Google, has not really been earned, and that they don't, the level of compensation, the tens of billions of dollars that these individuals have earned, isn't necessary. They don't need that amount. The idea essentially is that society could redistribute the payoffs for their success with little overall consequence. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions embedded in there. I maybe just skip one. I'm going to go to, I think maybe.
Choose whichever.
All right, so first I'd say, don't be fooled by the lone genius argument, okay? Bill Gates didn't invent Microsoft. He just came up with an idea that was so good that he could make an army of millionaires rich, an army of risk takers into millionaires. Same thing with Bezos and all these other guys. These companies are not created by one lone genius. They are created by armies of people. We know this because Europe can't create any of them. Japan can't create any of them. They all have way more engineers and scientists than we have. Okay, it's a mix of scientists and MBAs, largely the MBAs who really want to get rich and drive the thing over the goal line and aren't just some low genius out there. So you actually have to motivate large groups of people to do it. Second thing I tell you is, having been in an LBO shop or private equity shop and a venture capital firm, it's exactly the same. The returns are power law distributed. So if you cap the top, we at Bain Capital would never take a deal if you said, you know what, you get 3 times your money and then after that, I'll take 100% of everything over 3 times. We would never sign up for that because we get mediocre return. You're struggling to get good returns. You cap the upside, all the value is coming in the upside in that power law distributed 1 or 2 things that make enormous returns. So you look and you say, it's certainly the case that Bill Gates did not expect to be a 100 billionaire, however much money he had, when he started off doing this project, and he didn't need to do that. He didn't need to do that to motivate him. He was lucky it was unexpected. Yeah, but a whole army of risk takers came behind him after it happened. And today, when you look at our economy relative to Europe and Japan, what you find is that we have a huge sector of our economy and a very large sector of our most talented people determined to take the risk, determined to succeed, determined to make money. Now, the one argument is they're just doing it for the status. Okay, now, I'd say this. It is true that in the United States, things like our ability to fire employees allow us to move from manufacturing to, say, information technology easier than Europe. There's less friction. There's less regulation. There's less friction. Maybe we have the entrepreneurial spirit in our blood, even though almost all the internet entrepreneurs are from foreign countries. It's a little hokey, but let's say all that's true. It doesn't change the fact that if status was the driver, we'd be seeing a significant amount of technology coming out of Europe and Japan, innovation. We don't see any, virtually none. I mean, not any, but 7 times as much coming out of the United States. So it's hard to believe that status alone, lone geniuses, cap the upside, and I think what you find is the following. People will make these arguments. I hear this often. Austin Goolsbee made this to me. The tax rate's high in California. That didn't slow down innovation in California. So why does the tax rate matter? Okay. Yeah, if you go to Silicon Valley, it'll increase your chances of success tenfold. So let's just, I don't know, let's call that 1,000%. And then they slap a 10% tax on that, so you're at 9 times instead of 10 times. okay, you're still going to take the risk because the tax isn't great enough. Now, does the rest of the world and the rest of America like the idea that the municipal labor unions of California are taxing America's high-tech industry because it happens to be there because there was a defense industry there and there was good weather there and there was a bit of happenstance that let it land there and Stanford was there and there was certain reasons why it landed there. Okay, so they and New York can impose a tax that the rest of us can't impose because they happen to be sitting at that piece of geography instead of our piece of geography. Is that good for the rest of us? I don't think it is. And is their schools better? Are their poor better off? Do they have higher mobility as a result? Any measure, they do not. So you go, why should we allow that to happen? They can do it because the returns, the institutional power in those institutions is so great that they can impose a tax. It will absolutely slow the growth a little bit, but it'll still grow fast enough for them to maximize their tax revenue. I'm not sure that what's in our best interest is to maximize their tax revenues, but it's to maximize our consumer surplus.
Sure. Shifting gears a little bit, we have kind of a number of students in the room. But so you spent much of your career at Bain Capital and earned income by improving productivity of firms. So not everybody in the room, but a number of students in the room are from the business school. Many will be future managers tasked with exactly this specific problem, figuring out how to improve the productivity of your particular firm. What advice would you have for our students?
So I'd have different advice. Different advice if you're a manager and you're there versus how do you get to be a manager. Couple thoughts. The first thing I tell you is it's a lot like professional athletes. You have to be extremely determined. You have to practice more than everybody else. You have to work harder than everybody else. The way you make money is by serving customers more effectively than competitors. And then they give you their money. And so you have to be determined. And it's true in athletics too, right? You go, hey, I'm not going into soccer, I'm going into football because the money's in football, and then I'm going to score more than everybody else, and I'm going to serve the customers more effectively. And if you don't serve the customers more effectively, they will be quick to fire you and hire somebody else. I think that is the truth of business. So be prepared for who actually is going to succeed. It is people who are very determined to succeed. And so my first advice would be quit watching TV, okay? I look at my daughter, 16 years old, if she's not studying, she's watching TV. I can't talk her out of it. Game of Thrones is a more interesting world than the world we live in, okay? But I'm telling you, the people who are succeeding in business are not sitting at home watching TV. They are out there kicking your ass. So that would be my first advice. My second is go get a mentor. You will not learn this on your own. You need a mentor to teach you, and you need a lot more mentoring than you think you do. Everybody says, okay, I learned all that 3 years, 5 years, 8 years. I got to get out of here. I got to do it myself. I'd say I spent 10 years at Bain Consulting, and I don't think there was any slowdown in the rate at which I was learning stuff. So find a great mentor. The next thing I would tell you is think about the world from big business versus small business. Small business is very glorified, it's very romanticized, but the problems that are being worked on by big business, just think of self-driving cars, internet surge, there are very important technologies in the big company sector. It's higher paying, it's lower risk, it's more interesting work. Don't give it short shift, I think. And there's a lot to learn in big business. I would say, the thing I would tell you, I told you about venture capital returns and unsystematic risk. I'd say you need to be very thoughtful and careful about taking risk. Don't take the risk until you really have an idea that you think, man, this is an idea that can work. Not, this is kind of a half-ass idea, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But I would say go work in an organization that has accounting systems and internal audit and a marketing department and a logistics department and a manufacturing department and mentoring programs. There is an enormous amount to be learned in that environment. And then the next thing I tell you is you got to pay for your seat at the table. Shut up and pay for your seat at the table. And it is 15 years in the making if you're lucky. So, you'll be 40 years old, they might be giving you a seat at the table where they're actually making a decision if you did all the things I just told you to do. If you do a half-assed version of that, you will not be in the room. You'll be complaining about not having a seat at the table, and they will be saying, I am sick of hearing your complaints. Let's get rid of this guy and get a young person who's ready to come back and start and take their place. And they will do that, and they will do that quickly. So, I would say that what I would tell you is, if you were lucky enough to become a manager, I would suggest there's a book that made a huge impression on me called Leadership on the Line. I quote the book in my second book. I have almost a page devoted to it. The publisher said I was reprinting so much of it that I was running into copyright. But it talks about what organizations will do to you personally to thwart the changes that you are trying to implement. I will tell you that there are two kinds of changes in the world: technological changes and what I'll call political changes. And it says, just assume all the technological changes have been done. So any opportunity you find is a political problem that hasn't been solved, and that there are stakeholders and there's a power struggle. And if you wade in there, one, with a technological solution, you're being incredibly naive. And two, if you're brokering a political solution, you really need to know what the heck you're doing, because they will eat you up and spit you out. And it talks about the ways in which you will do that. So one of the ways is it'll marginalize you. It'll say, hey, why don't you go work in this project over here that doesn't matter. The second thing it'll do is it'll try to co-opt you. It'll say, hey, it's us against them, right? And you're with us, aren't you? Oh, what do you mean? You have a good idea that you think you're going to share the wealth here? No, you're going to give the wealth to us. Otherwise, you're not on our team. And you can go join the other team. Oh, by the way, the other team doesn't want you either. And the third thing it'll do is exactly what you saw done to President Trump, which is it will say you are immoral, you lack character, you're incompetent, and it will come after you with a vengeance. It will go scrutinize your expense reports. It'll find every reason to try to push you out, because the organization will fight back hard. And the reason is because, hey, it's not like they didn't think about that change. They've been successful in fighting that change off for a long, long time. So don't be naive, I guess is what I would say.
Very good, very good. I will ask one more question. If you have questions, if you want to just fill them out on the note cards and maybe pass them to the center. And I don't know if our club members can help collect them, perhaps. Okay, thank you. Trying to think here. What is the last question I should ask? Yes. What is the top solution the U.S. could look to help improve the economy?
I believe that is high-skilled immigration. So I think I would say this: so I think we have two opportunities, but I think one is very hard to implement. One is, I know you had a question there about moral responsibility. I think we need to go to our talented Americans and say, the talent was randomly distributed, whether by God or by nature. You happen to be the lucky recipient of that talent. As a lucky recipient of that talent, you have a moral responsibility to use that talent to help your fellow man. And yes, you're going to be richly rewarded along the way, and I think even liberal economists would agree that you have to create about $5 of value to put $1 in your own pocket. So there's nothing wrong with trying to put that $1 in your pocket, because you've got to create a lot of value for other people to put that $1 in your pocket. But you don't get to go off and be an art history major. Okay, you should become a business student. You should go and do engineering. You should become a communications major. You should get into the world of helping people. And I would say in business, I came from business, so I'm partial to business. We help our fellow man by serving them as customers. And then you wake up every morning and you say, you know what, I'm going to do a good deed today. Yeah, and then you go back to work serving your fellow man as a customer, and you don't have time to do all those charitable deeds. And if you look at what has increased the prosperity of the world over the last 200, 300, 2,000 years, it is business. It is serving customers. It's commerce. It's serving your fellow man as customers. It's not charity. It's government, but to a far lesser extent. So, but do I hold out any hope of persuading the talented people to all go into this business? No. So what would I do in the interim? Well, so second thing I would do is I would certainly work on trying to improve our education system. You know, I think there's a much more practical version of education that we can give people. I don't think, you know, probably everybody in this room took calculus in high school, and, you know, I think you go like, I'm never going to use that. I never used it, and, you know, I was an engineer. It's sort of like, we could have a much more practical conceptual version to education that I think would make people a lot more effective than we're trying to solve the Sputnik problem from the 1950s by making everybody take chemistry and math and stuff that is just not, I don't think, so useful. But again, I hold out no hope and promise for that. Any change in our lifetime. Oh, by the way, if we were successful, we wouldn't get the benefits for 20 years when people came through the school system. So what do I think we need to do? High-skilled immigration. We should go out to and what I would do is I would go out and I would go look for people who are in the top 5%. Okay? And I would say, if we don't go get those people, don't kid yourself, Google and Facebook and Microsoft are already getting those people. They're Skyping them in from Romania, you know, every day, all the time. And the doctors and the school teachers and the bus drivers and the waitresses are all serving them in Romania. It's crazy. And why is it happening? Because Google and Facebook and all these guys want an arb on the real estate. They go, Romanian real estate's cheap, so I don't have to pay them. I don't have to pay the Romanian landlord anywhere near as much as I'd have to pay the New York landlord or the San Francisco landlord. And we let all that get away from us. So I don't like the idea of bringing in a 90th percentile guy or an 80th percentile guy, because I want our 80th and 90th percentile guys to get the benefits of upward pressure on their wages. But when you get to the 95th percentile or the 99th percentile, it seems crazy to me, because businesses are not going to go, oh, geez, I guess you didn't let me bring those people in, so I just sit on my hands and do nothing. That's just not the way it works. So we got to go out there and we have to get these people and bring them in. I'll give you just a rough set of numbers, by the way. We issue 1 million green cards a year. There are 7 billion non-Americans. Okay, they're the top 5%. We have about 120 million full-time workers in that range. So the top 5%, 6 million workers that are here in the United States. 7 billion non-Americans in the world, top 5%, 350 million. Half of them, we don't know who they are. They've never been tested, probably never even went to school. Half of them are too old, they're too young, that's not going to work. And half of the remainder of those guys are never going to move. You know, they're already established in their jobs, they're not leaving. You get down to a pool of about 50 million people. Okay, we have about 6 million of them. If we had another 5 or 6 million, we could potentially double our growth rate. Okay? And it's not unconceivable at 1 million green cards a year on a pool of 50 million people that you couldn't do this in fairly short order. Okay, and it would put enormous upward pressure on everybody else's wages. And the problem we face is a tremendous shortage of talent in the United States and a huge, low-skilled, unsupervised workforce that would benefit greatly from more supervision. And you know, we see this. We see declining productivity. We see increases in opioid addiction. We see declines in marriages. We see the symptoms of everybody in this room. You guys, the world is your oyster. People that can self-supervise, it has never been a better world, never been a better economy to be in. But for people who have difficulty self-supervising themselves, it is a dangerous place. You know, you get hurt, it's easy to fall into opioid addiction. You know, you get mad at your spouse, it's easy to get divorced and not raise your children anymore. There's many paths today that you could end up down that wouldn't have happened in the 1950s when, you know, there was much more respect for authority and institutions and things like that. And we haven't provided the leadership that's needed in this vacuum.
Well, on that note, I want to give a big thank you to Ed for taking time to join us tonight, and thanks to everybody for